Good morning. Guess we can get started. Welcome to the panel covering Dissent in Comparative Perspective. My name is Eamon Kircher-Allen, and I'll be moderating today. I have to say I'm really humbled and honored to be presenting such an accomplished group of people. Between the three of them, we have a Nobel Prize winner, a Pulitzer winner, and a winner of the International Press Freedom Award. And so I'm trying very hard not to feel intimidated as I pose questions to them. With such an impressive trio, I'm going to limit my remarks as much as possible right now and also later on, because I would guess that if there's anything I have to say, they can probably say it better than me. And I also want to make sure that the audience has a chance to, plenty of time to interact and ask questions after we get done with initial remarks and a panel discussion. So let me briefly move on to introductions. To my left, I have Nadira Isayeva. She's a Russian journalist who has been internationally recognized for her reporting on security issues in the North Caucasus. From 2007 to 2011, she was editor-in-chief of the weekly newspaper Chernovik, I hope I'm saying that right, which means the draft, in Dagestan. And the newspaper has been described by Reporters Without Borders as Dagestan's leading independent newspaper. And then from 2008 to 2011, she and four colleagues from the newspaper were placed under investigation and accused of exciting hatred against law enforcement authorities. And while they won at trial, the authorities changed their tactics and pressured her to step down. Her reporting and prosecution have drawn the attention of numerous press and press freedom organizations, and the editorial board of the Washington Post has praised her work, calling her, quote, a first-rate journalist and a hero. She was a recipient of an International Press Freedom Award in 2010 for risking her freedom and security for her reporting, and she is currently a visiting scholar at the Harriman Institute here at Columbia. Far into the table, we have Clifford J. Levy, who was named deputy editor of the New York Times Metro section in March of 2011. Previously, he was based at the Moscow bureau of the New York Times, most recently as a bureau chief. He joined the bureau as Moscow correspondent in July 2006 and had been a special projects reporter for the Metro desk previously since 2000. Before joining the Metro desk, he served as chief of the paper's Albany bureau and as a political reporter, City Hall correspondent, and a Newark correspondent. He joined the Times in 1990 as a political reporter, as a news assistant, and was promoted to reporter in 1992. And before coming to the Times, he was a reporter for the New York Bureau of United Press International. Mr. Levy won the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting for a three-part series that exposed the sometimes fatal neglect of mentally ill people in a privately run adult homes regulated by New York State. He also received a George Polk Award for the series. In 1998, he won a Polk Award for articles on the campaign finance practices of prominent state officials in New York. And in 2009, Mr. Levy was the international print winner for the RFK Journalism Awards for Kremlin Rules, a series about how Russia's leaders have eroded democracy and human rights. The Society of Professional Journalists awarded Mr. Levy the 2008 Sigma Delta Chi Award for Foreign Correspondents for the series, and he also won a 2009 Epi Award in the category of Best Web Special Feature Enterprise. And he won a third George Polk Award in 2010 for Above the Law, a series about corruption and abuse of power in Russia 2 decades after the collapse of communism. I encourage you to check out his impressive work on the New York Times website. Joseph E. Stiglitz was born in Gary, Indiana in 1943, and he's a graduate of Amherst College. He received his PhD from MIT in 1967 and became a full professor at Yale in 1970. He was 27 years old. And in 1979 was awarded the John Bates Clark Award, which is given biennially by the American Economic Association to the economist under 40 who has made the most significant contribution to the field. He's taught at Princeton, Stanford, MIT, and was a Drummond professor and a fellow of All Souls College at Oxford. And he is now university professor at Columbia University in New York and co-chair of Columbia University's Committee on Global Thought. And he's also co-founder and co-president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue here at Columbia. In 2001, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics for his analyses of markets with asymmetric information. And he was also a lead author of the 1995 report on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. In 2011, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. So now that I'm done reading off this impressive list of awards, we can move on to the discussion. And as you know, this panel is part of a conference sponsored by Columbia's Harriman Institute, and it's one of several events commemorating the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. The broader theme of this conference is the Cold War over, Russia and U.S. media from perestroika to the 2012 elections. And so I know today that when we're talking about covering dissent, we'll be talking a lot about questions like whether the Cold War past continues to influence media in Russia, or whether we're looking at a completely new media landscape there that is engaging dissent in new ways. But we'll also get into what challenges journalists are facing in Russia today, whether these are different or the same as what they've experienced in the past. But I also hope that we can zoom out of the Russia discussion to talk more broadly about covering dissent in the world today in the context of new media, and especially because last year was such a banner year for dissent, from Cairo to Moscow to Athens and even to Wall Street here in New York City. And I think as we hear about the examples of covering dissent in Russia, it will be a very fascinating and instructive jumping off place for having kind of a broader discussion about what it means to cover dissent in the world today. And I hope we can get into questions of where the line is between activism and reporting, and whether that line, I think sometimes it's in the American context, it's taken for granted that that line should exist. In other countries, it may not be so, and it may actually be changing here too. And so I hope we can talk about what some of the hazards and the opportunities of blurring that line are. And also what some of the successes and failures of media in covering dissent have been in the last year, in Russia, but also in other countries. But let's definitely start with Russia. It's a perfect jumping off point. I would like to pass the microphone over to Ms. Isayeva, who will talk about her experiences and connect some of the dots for us. So, thank you.
Thank you. Спасибо. Так как время у меня ограничено 15 минутами, а вопрос очень обширный.
Since I'm limited in the time, I have only 15 minutes to talk, and there are many things.
Yeah, we'll get her a microphone.
Well, we'll try to. We cannot put it in the middle. We'll have to move over.
Why don't you give?
Use
Joe's microphone.
We cannot. It's okay. It's okay. They're all fixed. Let's see. Unfortunately, my time is limited. I only have 15 minutes to talk, and the subject I would like to cover is very broad.
И я разделю свое выступление на две части.
So I would like to divide my presentation in two parts.
Первую часть я хочу посвятить непосредственно ситуации со СМИ в Дагестане, где я работаю.
So I would like to dedicate the first part to the situation with mass media in Dagestan. I'm from Dagestan, in the Caucasus, in the northern Caucasus in particular.
И вторая часть будет посвящена тому, как протесты, происходящие в России, коррелируют с тем, что происходит на Кавказе.
And thank you. And the second part of my presentation is about, the unbalance between the protests in Moscow and in Russia and with what happens in Dagestan.
Модератор уже представил и газету, и ситуацию, которая происходила со мной, и с газетой в целом, которую я возглавляла 4 года.
The moderator of our panel discussion has already represented me and the newspaper I worked for 4 years, being its editor-in-chief.
Поэтому начну, скажем так, с факта. 16 декабря 2011 года был убит учредитель этой газеты.
So I will begin with the facts. On December 16th, 2011, the founder of the newspaper,
Хаджи Мурат
Камалов, was killed.
И это убийство надо расценивать как некую такую завершающее завершающий этап в целой серии ликвидации институтов свободной прессы в северокавказских республиках России.
This killing should be viewed as the final, drop, which ruined the mass media, free mass media in the Northern Caucasus.
Ранее сходные процессы практически имели место в Ингушетии, в Чечне, Кабардино-Балкарии.
Similar cases can be remembered, that happened in Chechnya, Ingushetia, and Kabardino-Balkaria.
Сейчас я не имею в виду информационные агентства, крупные, российские, международные, которые, естественно, присутствуют в регионе.
So, and I don't mean, the branches, like offices of big information agencies, but more like, local newspapers.
Речь идет о прессе как институте.
And I want to talk about mass media, about press as an institution.
И таким образом можно сказать, что регион северокавказский, один из наиболее чувствительных для российской власти, он остался без, скажем так, без информационного покрытия и освещения.
The region, the Northern Caucasus, which is one of the most sensitive regions for the Moscow power in Moscow, is left without any coverage, any informational coverage by mass media.
И это регион с высокой степенью присутствия, чрезмерного присутствия федеральных силовых структур и, соответственно, распространения нарушений прав человека.
So this is the region where the excessive numbers of law enforcement, federal law enforcement, are concentrated, and this is the region where the civil rights and human rights are violated grossly.
Это регион с очень сложной структурой конфликтов, о которых мы здесь говорить не будем.
So this is the region with a very complex structure of conflict, and I don't have time to cover it now in detail.
Поэтому я хочу сразу перейти к некому, скажем так, к отношению, Кавказа к кавказского населения северокавказских республиках к митингам российским и, соответственно, вот этой протестующей массы в России к кавказской проблематике.
So that's why I would like, to tackle more the question of unbalanced protest, so to speak. Then how the population of the Northern Caucasus views the protests in Moscow and how they react to them.
Протестная масса российская, основная сейчас протестная масса, оппозиция, я бы сказала, она состоит все-таки из трех частей, фрагментирована.
Speaking about the protesters in Moscow, and I would like, to emphasize that, you can divide them into three parts.
Одна часть, на мой взгляд, наиболее дееспособная, это националисты.
One part of it, which is always ready to act and very effective, are Russian nationalists.
Вторая часть – это демократическое, либеральное крыло.
So the second part is the liberal democratic wing.
И третья, скажем так, часть, это массы населения, вышедшие на протест, но они в принципе не имеют каких-то очевидных политических выраженных предпочтений.
And the third part is the great numbers of people who joined in the protests, but they don't have any political views or ideas, they advocate.
Если вы обратили внимание, эта масса людей старается избегать каких-то политического структурирования.
So this great number of people I've just mentioned, they try to stay away from any political issues.
Она старается избегать, скажем так, каких-то лидерских предпочтений.
And they don't have any preference as far as leadership of this movement is concerned.
Теперь либерально-демократическая часть, она, на мой взгляд, плохо организована.
And in my opinion, the liberal democratic part of the protesters are very poorly organized.
Там, очевидно, есть проблема лидера,
Mhm.
консолидирующего.
So they have the problem, of leaders, or rather the absence of them, who could consolidate them.
Очевидно, проблемы с идейной платформой.
They obviously don't have a strong ideological platform.
Ну и как минимум текущей программой.
And they don't have a well-defined program.
Теперь о националистах.
Now a few words about nationalists.
Вот, очевидно, что в России, скажем так, влияние идеи национализма сейчас достаточно существенно.
It seems that the influence of the ideas advocated by nationalists is very significant, very strong.
Игнорировать его не может никто из, скажем так, никакие силы в политическом спектре России.
So none of the forces in the political spectrum of Russia can ignore them.
А реверансы в сторону националистов делают и уже президент Путин, и даже какие-то отдельные представители либерального крыла.
So, Putin and his government, as well as some representative of the liberal democratic movement, feel, they're ingratiated to the nationalists.
Вот на этом, скажем так, фоне очень многие журналисты, правозащитники, знающие, что люди с Кавказа, как правило, отличаются активной гражданской позицией, задают вопрос, почему Кавказ не присоединяется к митингам протеста.
So, and against this background, journalists and many activists in the civil rights movement ask a question: why the Caucasus, the Northern Caucasus, doesn't join in the protests?
На мой взгляд, это поведение кавказцев очень прагматично.
In my opinion, the behavior of the Caucasus is very pragmatic.
То есть немного расскажу о Кавказе и о том, как он голосует. То есть протестующая масса вышла против фальсификации выборов.
Well, just a few words about the Caucasus and how the election were carried out there. The striking majority of people refused to vote because they were against the falsification of the election.
Выборы в Госдуму, выборы президента России.
And the elections to the State Duma and the elections, the presidential elections in
Теперь
Russia.
вопрос. Государственная Дума, значит ли она что-то в российском политическом пространстве как институт?
So, and another question: does the State Duma has any significance in the political scene in Russia?
Ну, ответ, по-моему, очевиден для тех, кто хорошо знает российскую специфику.
So the answer is obvious for those who knows the political scene in Russia as of today.
Соответственно, низкие, наверное, приближающиеся к нулю явки в Кавказских республиках на выборах 4 декабря парламентских, они в принципе объяснимы.
And the fact that like almost 0% of people showed up at the voting stations in the Caucasus, in the Northern Caucasus, is an answer to that question, and they can be explained.
Если вы проведете элементарный тест и опросите всех своих знакомых, ходили вы на выборы, они скажут нет. А ходили на выборы ваших знакомых? Нет. Ходили ли на выборы знакомые ваших знакомых? Вы тоже услышите ответ.
So every time you ask somebody, like, did you vote? Or ask somebody who knows somebody else, did you vote? And the answer will be no.
На президентских выборах ситуация была немножечко другая.
The situation was slightly different in the presidential election.
Отличие заключалось в том, что избиратели, а это в большинстве преимущественно это были бюджетники и госслужащие, просто в добровольно-принудительном порядке привели к урнам.
So during the presidential elections, voters were forced to vote, and they were predominantly government employees and public sector workers.
Меняет ли это положение вещей? Думаю, что нет.
Does it change anything? I don't think it is.
Думаю, что нет. И соответственно, теперь другой вопрос. Как избирается глава республики?
So consequently, another question arises. How is the head of the republic elected?
Он назначается президентом страны.
Well, he is appointed by the president of Russia.
То есть, соответственно, граждане республики лишены права выбирать своего лидера.
So consequently, the population, like the citizens of the republic, are deprived of the right to elect the head of their republic.
Да, они формально имеют право выбирать депутатов Госдумы. Ни на что не влияет.
Officially, they have a right to elect delegates to the state Duma, but it doesn't change anything.
А как проходят выборы президента, вы знаете, страны, да?
And how the presidential elections are carried out, you know without me.
Возникает ситуация, когда участвовать в выборах просто бессмысленно.
The situation is that when it is absolutely senseless and useless to participate in the election.
Соответственно, участвовать в митингах против этих выборов тоже, против фальсификаций тоже бессмысленно.
So that's why to participate in the rallies, to protest, this situation is also doesn't have any sense.
Да, вы можете протестовать против фальсификации, но не забывайте, что правила установлены. Как бы ни просчитали эти голоса, правила установлены рестриктирующим законодательством.
So falsification, to protest against the falsification of the elections is absolutely futile, because the rules are set. No matter what you do and how you vote, there is certain set of rules that are followed in the election, and there are limitations.
То есть две стороны. С одной стороны, бессмысленно участвовать в выборах, то есть играть по правилам, условия которых задаете не вы. Это одна сторона вопроса.
So on the one hand, it is absolutely useless to play the games, the terms of which are imposed on you by somebody else.
Вторая сторона вопроса, вот именно, скажем так, усиление вот таких националистических каких-то, национал-патриотических их назовем, и даже шовинистических не заявлений, а, скажем так, дискурса в политическом российском пространстве. То есть она делает кавказцев чужаками вот в этом политическом поле.
So it's the situation with nationalistic patriotism, chauvinism in Russia, and everything that is popularized in that sense makes the citizens of republics in the Northern Caucasus outsiders.
Я хочу сказать, что в принципе низкие явки населения это и есть такая вот некая форма dissent, да, инакомыслия, выраженная явно.
So a very low percentage of voters is the manifestation of dissent, so to speak.
И в принципе это означает, что население не существует в рамках заданного правового поля.
So that means that the population of these republics is outside, the frames of the set up legitimate field.
И на этом фоне любые фальсификации, которые выдают стопроцентный результат, именно все-таки статистически, официальная статистика выдает, что именно северокавказские республики дают 95, чуть ли не 100% результат поддержки президента страны.
So, but if we look at the numbers, officially published numbers, we will see that the official numbers show that 95% of the voters in the republics of the Northern Caucasus vote.
И это происходит не потому, что кавказцы пассивны политически, а это есть, на мой взгляд, форма волеизъявления.
Don't vote, 90% не голосуют, да?
Нет, официальная статистика...
Official statistics is that 95% vote, but in fact, less than 5% vote.
Кавказ
votes.
всегда лидирует в поддержке официальных
Okay,
органов,
okay.
всегда. Официальные проценты.
So official numbers are always like, the Caucasus is always in the first ranks.
Но реальность такова, что люди просто игнорируют институт выборов как
But
таковой.
in reality, people simply ignore the Institute of Election.
В принципе, это означает полный, ну, я думаю, абсолютный кризис легитимности российской власти на
So
Кавказе.
this is the evidence of the crisis of any legitimate, existence of the Soviet power, of the Russian power. Sorry, just the
И
Soviet
завершить, скажем
in the
так,
Caucasus. So they basically, like in the minds of people, they don't exist.
хочу завершить в чем? Митинги в Дагестане, на Кавказе бывали многотысячные. Но последний митинг состоялся за 10 дней до первого митинга в Москве 4 декабря, и был он против беспредела со стороны силовиков.
So, but rallies do happen in the northern Caucasus. One of them happened 10 days before the first rally in Moscow on December 4th. And it was the rally to protest against the abuses of power by the federal law enforcement in that region.
Организаторы митинга обещали повторять свои митинги в случае неудовлетворения их требований по прекращению похищений и бессудных казней.
Participants of the rally on December 4th, they demanded that the federal enforcement stop to abduct the people and execute them without trial, and they plan to repeat their protests, now and then.
Но митинги не повторились, скорее всего, по причине угроз со стороны власти.
But protest rallies were not held again, and most likely because they were threatened by the authorities,
И
that
более
measures
того,
would be taken against them.
активные участники этих митингов, организаторы, на самом деле отказались, скажем так, присоединяться, синхронизировать свои митинги протеста с московскими.
And organizers of the rally in Dagestan eventually refused to synchronize their actions with the protests in Moscow.
То есть это тоже свидетельство того, что проблематика, стоящая agenda, да, на повестке дня здесь и общероссийская, она, видимо, различается.
So this is the evidence of the fact that the problems faced with protesters in Moscow and in Dagestan are different.
Я хочу закончить свое выступление небольшим таким забавным эпизодом.
And I would like to close my presentation with a short, rather amusing episode.
На одном из организационных собраний митингов в Москве обсуждался вопрос об альтернативных формах протеста существующей власти.
At one of the meetings of organizers of protests in Moscow, they discussed the possibility of alternative forms of protest against the existing power.
И вот было предложено 4 метода,
So
4 способа.
they discussed 4 methods.
Они все сводились к тому, чтобы подорвать финансовую базу действующей власти.
So they all boiled down to undermining the financial security of the government.
Это забрать деньги из банков, они все у нас преимущественно государственные.
So to pull all the money from the banks, which mostly all belong to the government,
Не платить налоги,
not to pay taxes,
не платить за коммунальные платежи.
not to pay rent and utilities,
И боюсь ошибиться, по-моему, игнорировать выборы.
and I think to ignore the election. I'm not sure, I may
И вот
be wrong.
когда дошла очередь до меня,
When it was my turn to speak,
я говорю, кавказцы, у нас 80% экономики, принято считать, что 80% экономики в тени. Соответственно, я говорю, что налогов мы не платим.
So when I began to speak, I reminded them that 80% of the economy in the Caucasus, in 80, is the shade economy, and we don't pay taxes.
У нас 80% денежного оборота это наличный оборот.
So the 80% of monetary circulation is in cash.
Соответственно, мы не держим деньги в банках.
So we don't keep our money in banks.
У нас одна из самых низких по России собираемость коммунальных платежей.
So we have one of the lowest in Russia payments for rent and utilities.
Соответственно, мы не платим коммунальных.
So sometimes we don't even pay them.
Мы не ходим на выборы.
So we don't we don't vote.
Соответственно, кавказцы давно уже протестуют.
So the inhabitants, like the population of the Northern Caucasus, have been protesting, for a long time by now.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So to move the conversation along and maybe take a bigger picture Russia perspective on the discussion, I'd like to invite Mr. Levy to speak.
So I'm going to keep my remarks relatively brief. I'm actually much more interested in engaging in a Q&A and a conversation here. I'm interested in learning what you're interested in learning about, especially given all the recent events in Russia. But one thing I do want to discuss very briefly is the nature of dissent in the Russia of Vladimir Putin and how that's different than what we historically think of as dissent in the Soviet Union or the former Soviet Union. I spent 5 years in Russia as a reporter for the New York Times based in Moscow. And one thing I was continually surprised about when I came back to the United States for a visit was how people thought that the Soviet Union still existed as an idea in practice in post-Soviet Russia. What I mean by that is people were constantly thinking that there was a kind of a brutal censorship that went on in Russia, that you could not criticize Putin at all, for example, and that the kind of practices, the kind of KGB-esque practices that existed for so many decades in the Soviet Union continued to exist in post-Soviet Russia. That, of course, is not true, and I think it's very important in understanding Russia now and in understanding the recent protests and what will evolve from those recent protests. It's very important to understand the nature of journalism and the nature of dissent in Russia. And I think the easiest way to understand that is the amount of pressure that people come under in Russia is really goes hand in hand with the size of the organization. So in other words, in Russia currently, especially before the recent protests, the television stations which had the widest influence were very strictly controlled by the Kremlin. You could, if you were a prominent opposition politician, you were rarely, if ever, allowed to appear on the state television news. There are 3 primary television stations controlled by the government, and opposition figures almost are never seen on them, or were never seen on them. Moving down the spectrum, if you look at radio, there was one station called Echo Moskvy, which regularly featured opposition politicians, regularly featured the kind of discourse that you might hear on NPR in the United States or on CNN, for example. And that was almost like a kind of an opposition ghetto to some extent. I think the powers that be thought that was just kind of liberals talking to liberals. It did not, as a result, have that much influence, and so they largely allowed it to exist. Then you move farther down to the newspapers, which have relatively small circulations in Russia. They might have a circulation of 100,000 or 200,000 for the broadsheet, and they often could publish critical information about the government. They could quote opposition political figures. And then you move to the internet, which is, in Russia, is free. It's not like, people often have a misconception that the internet in Russia is like the internet in China, that it's very strictly controlled, and that is not the case at all. There are, of course, I'm talking in generalizations. There are caveats. Even at the newspapers, for example, or the radio stations, there were certain subjects that throughout the Putin era, or at least the Putin era until recently, were taboo, especially official corruption, the vast theft of wealth by politicians, of the state's wealth politicians, even at the best newspapers, even the best investigative reporters often were very loath to touch those. And of course, we know about cases of journalists who were beaten up or even killed in Russia because they touched on some of those subjects. But in general, you could write in a newspaper, Putin is a terrible president. You could certainly write that on the internet and nothing would happen to you. So I think it's very important that people understand that. We have sitting in the audience, for example, Gregory Shvedov, who's the brilliant editor of a web publication called Caucasian Knot, which very closely covers the events in the Caucasus, very, very routinely writes about opposition politicians, very routinely writes about people who criticize the government. Now, of course, they do face pressure from time to time on the local level in the Caucasus, but at least from the state, from Moscow, I think there's a relatively hands-off policy toward them. And Gregory will be on a panel later today, and you can hear him firsthand. So I just want to give that sort of overview of the situation currently, and I think that should perhaps help us to understand what's going to happen from this point. One thing that's been the most striking to people in Moscow is how the state television covered the first protests that occurred after the parliamentary elections in December. I think for journalists in Moscow, and even those of us who just left Moscow, when we saw that opposition protests were actually appeared on the television news, we practically fell out of our chairs. It was something that just had never happened before and was to some extent a watershed moment. Now, whether that's going to continue, we don't know. But it is a real sign. If you're looking for markers, if you're looking to see how the political dynamic is changing in Russia right now, look toward the television news. That will give you a real idea of almost that the government, that the Kremlin feels they need to let some of the pressure off. They feel that this is kind of one concession or compromise that they can make to the opposition, to public dissent in Russia, and especially in Moscow today. So with that just little briefing, I'll turn it over to Joe, or I'll turn it over to the moderator, or turn it over to Joe. But then afterwards, I hope we can have some good questions and answers and discuss some of these subjects in a little more depth.
Thanks. Yep. Joe, please.
Okay, let me make two sets of comments. The first has to do with the coverage of protest movements in general, and I'll begin in a way with the protest movement that got the most coverage about a decade ago, which was the anti-globalization movement that began with the WTO protest in December 1999. The press coverage of that I thought was both interesting and very good. Some people criticize that protest movement, and this is a general point I want to make, criticize that protest movement for not having an agenda, without having clear objectives of melange. Different people were coming together. Some were concerned about development, some about the environment, some about labor rights. And some of the coverage said there's no coherent message here. But I think that really missed the point of the protest. They were all saying there was a common message, which was all these various groups agreed that something was wrong with the way globalization was being managed. And when I said the press coverage was fairly good, the response to that was that the press looked at some of the particular accusations that were being made by each of these groups about the environment, about human rights, about trade, about the equity, and they found that there was a lot of validity in it. And so that, in a way, that protest movement, I thought, was very effective because it brought to a general consciousness an awareness that something was wrong with the way our political leaders were managing the globalization process. And over the ensuing 12, 13 years, many of the complaints have not only been validated, but there have actually been, in some areas, change. Less than you would have hoped, but at least some areas. Let me just give you a couple examples. One of the strands of the protest movement was the anti-globalization, was that the trade agreements were unfair to the developing countries. And so the eventual next round of trade agreement, nothing came out of the Seattle meeting in December of 1999, but after the 9/11, there was a moment of global solidarity, you might say, and a new round of trade talks was begun in November of 2011, and that round was called a development round to try to rectify the imbalances of the previous one. In a sense, the protest movement had won an early victory. It was a half victory because in the ensuing 10 years, nothing was done. But at least the notion had been recognized that previous trade agreements had been unfair. And so I think that was a real victory for that protest movement. Other issues that were raised were that the global governance system was flawed, and that issue got crystallized in a way in November of 2008, in the midst of the recession of 2008 after Lehman Brothers collapsed, and the world went from the G8 to the G20, recognizing that you could not have global decision-making without representatives from the emerging markets, at least the larger emerging markets. And at the series of G20 meetings, there was an agreement to change the governance of the World Bank and the IMF. There was an agreement, we thought, that the next leader of the IMF and the World Bank would be chosen in a meritocratic way and almost surely not be from the United States and Europe. Well, the United States agreed to it, but then reneged on that agreement, as reneged on the development round agreement. And right now, there's a lot of discussion about who will be the next head of the World Bank, and whether the United States is going to again insist that it be an American. But I think the point I want to make is these protest movements, that protest movement was very successful in bringing consciousness of a set of things that was wrong with globalization, and really has begun a process of reform that's slow, but I think is in many ways almost surely irreversible. Well, the protest movement that began with the Arab Spring, the protest in Tunisia, and then Egypt, and then that moved all around the world. I think it has similarly been criticized for not having an agenda, but I think it has succeeded in bringing to the fore an awareness that some things are wrong. And that, I think, is really the function of these protest movements. I think the press coverage, in a way, has not been quite as good as it was during the globalization protest a decade ago. And I'll explain what I mean by that. In the case of the globalization protests, as I said before, there were a large number of allegations about what was wrong with globalization, and the press looked at those allegations, and out of that there came a broad consensus about a number of things that were wrong. And those are things that have since been subjects of a great deal of global discussion. In the case of the Arab Spring and the protests that followed out of that, there's not been as clear a discussion of why these protests occurred in these particular countries and what really is wrong. The reason why I say that is obviously these are protests that are partly about lack of political accountability, lack of democracy, but there are a lot of dictatorships around the world. And the question was, why did these particular dictatorships lead to these protest movements? And my sense is there's been a lot less discussion of trying to hone in on why did it appear in these particular countries at these particular times. The grievances that have been felt have been longstanding, and then why did they emerge at that particular time? And thirdly, the protest movements in the United States and in Spain and in many of the Western countries seemed in many ways similar to some of the protests in the Arab Spring, but we have democracies. So what was the issue there why were these protests in democratic countries that in many ways were similar to and inspired by the Arab Spring? So let me just very briefly suggest a couple of the answers to these questions. And I think, or perhaps they haven't gotten as much attention in the press as they should have. First, I think one of the reasons that the protests have emerged in Western democracies, like the United States and Spain, is that originally there was hope that the political system would respond to the economic problems, but they didn't. And there was a sense of disillusionment, a little bit, not as bad perhaps as in the Caucasus, but still a sense of disillusionment at the political system, that the bankers in the United States had brought on the crisis, and yet they were the only ones who were doing well. 3/4 of Americans wanted more profound banking regulation reform than we got. And we sort of had a balance between 10 banks and 200 million Americans, and that was an even balance between that 10 and the 200 million. So there was a sense, and an understandable sense, that that the political system had failed. Not obviously as badly as in Tunisia or Egypt, but still it had failed. Secondly, one of the things I think that was not covered as clearly, say in the case of Tunisia, was it wasn't just that there were economic problems. There have been a lot of economic problems. There are economic problems in many other countries around the world. But there was a sense that there was something deeply unfair about the way society and the economy were functioning. It wasn't just that there were 25 or 30% unemployment or even higher among the youth, but those who got jobs were those who were politically connected and politically connected to a very corrupt political system. So those who worked hard, played by the rules, did well at school, were not the ones getting jobs. It was the ones who had parents who were well connected who got the jobs. And this notion of fairness is, I think, a very deeply seated notion. And there are a lot of research in economics that have supported the view that this is people feel very strongly about fairness. Anybody who has children know that that's something they care about very, very intensely. And it was the failure of the system to be fair that really brought out the protest in Tunisia. It wasn't true in all the countries, but I think it was that element that was very strong in the United States as well. and in the Donados in Spain. And especially after the crisis, the notion that the only people who were doing well were the bankers who caused the crisis, and 99% of the rest of society was suffering, was a real sense of inequity. And that's where the motto that became Occupy Wall Street, "We are the 99%, was really a statement of a gross feeling of unfairness. And I think the press has done a fairly good job about covering in the United States this sense of unfairness, but didn't look at it as much in some of the other countries. An awareness of the incentive pay, the bonuses being unfair, has been one of the themes that has been picked up. And the third and final point I want to make is a common theme in most of the protest movements that have occurred in the last year is that not only is there is both a political and an economic problem. Say if there were an economic problem, the politics were able to address it, I don't think there would have been the protest. There are many dictatorships, but the dictatorships where the economy is functioning well, you don't see protests. Or at least you don't see as strong protest. But when both of them, both the economics and the politics don't function, that's when you see these protests. And that's what happened in the United States. It's what many sense in Egypt and in many of the other countries where there's a protest. Let me just speak for a moment about Russia and the failure of the economy as well as the politics. And I think it would have been interesting I would like to have seen a little bit more coverage of the deeper roots of the discontent going back to 1990. There was a hope after the fall of the Soviet Union that more democratic governments would arise. And there was hope that of economic reform that was meaningful. In fact, things didn't work out that way. And I think this is an area where the U.S. has played a very important role. The U.S., including some people whose names have been bandied for the head of the World Bank, pushed shock therapy on Russia and the other countries in transition. And the result was not particular economic success. Most people became worse off. And so the hope that this transition from a dysfunctional political and economic system would bring prosperity wasn't realized. And then the United States helped support a government that helped transfer vast amounts of wealth to some oligarchs, creating inequality and a kind of unfairness. And so again, we were implicated. And again, I don't think there's been enough accountability for the role that we played in that. One story that many of you may know, it is very well known in Russia, but has not been covered very well in the United States, is the story of Schleifer, the Harvard team that was responsible for the privatization or helping move the privatization, but in which, and it was called the Rule of Law Group, and in fact it was rife with corruption and insider trading and set an example for what shouldn't be done. and set an example in a way for what it meant, a market economy meant. A market economy a little bit like the lack of moral values that we've seen in the United States in our financial sector. So in a way, there has been a little culpability in the case of the United States in undermining a democratic economic reform transition. And I'm not sure, as I say, that has been adequately covered. The result of this is, with the failure of the reform, is the creation of state capitalism of a very peculiar kind, and one where I think it's not I think 20 years, it's not a normal market economy. I think we can say that, and it's not created the kind of, there are some areas where there's somewhat of a market economy, but the transition to a vibrant market economy ought to be contrasted with what's happened in China, where you might say the market economy is thriving in a more vibrant way, even though there still is a strong element of state capitalism, but they've allowed this other side to develop. Much less protest, partly because living standards are going up, even though there is less openness in the sense. Although, interestingly, and this was a little bit, I thought, interesting from what Clifford said, in China, they have allowed the press to attack corruption in the government. And they've used the press as a way of eyes to help the government make sure that government isn't corrupt. So they succeeded, for instance, the press played a very important role in bringing down the railroad minister, and now there, strong reporting of corruption in that ministry, and an accounting system is going on. So in a sense, what is interesting in this little contrast is that while they have, in some sense, less free of a press, they've allowed the press to play a role in disciplining the political system as long as they don't go too high. So where they draw the lines are somewhat different, but it can be fairly strong attacks against particular agencies, particular individuals for corruption. Well, with that, let me just stop and open up questions.
Great. Yeah, I do want to make sure that we have time to have a few question and answers. And while we're preparing for those, I wonder if Cliff and Nadira have any reaction to this idea that a successful coverage of dissent is one that introduces some of the main ideas, at least, and the main grievances of protesters into kind of the mainstream dialogue. And how do you achieve this when, as you said, there's fundamental misunderstandings about, in the audience that you're speaking to, about what the landscape is like in Russia, thinking that it's still like the Soviet Union, or maybe not understanding that there are big differences between the grievances in the Caucasus and those of the protesters in Moscow?
Well, I would just say a couple things. First of all, I think that the role of the journalist in covering dissent is markedly different if you are a domestic journalist, like my fellow panelist, or if you're a foreign correspondent like I was. The domestic reporters, of course, are part of the very fabric of what they're covering. They've experienced it. They may have come under pressure, whether it's intense pressure or kind of a softer pressure, as they have often in Russia. And so their relationship to these topics is, I think, much different than what we were writing about them. And I think a lot of the grievances that were aired in the last few months in Russia since the December parliamentary elections were things that I reported on. My colleague Luke Harding is in the back, who reported for The Guardian for several years from Moscow. He reported on those topics. I don't think those issues were foreign, pardon the pun, to any of our readers. And I don't think that they were foreign to the domestic audience in Russia either. I think what was striking, at least in the wake of the protests, was, as I mentioned earlier, how in some of the media outlets where these subjects were taboo before, they became a little less taboo after the protests. And I think that was really the difference. When state television is actually covering these demonstrations in the center of Moscow and covering them relatively objectively, because if all of us who've reported in Russia can recall, it's not like state television completely ignored the protests in the past. What they would do they would belittle them, they would essentially slander them. It would be a kind of black PR, as they refer to it in Russia, they would use against them. You'd actually have sometimes a half-an-hour documentaries that would air on some of the Russian channels that would be essentially lengthy screeds against the opposition protesters. So again, it's not like that information didn't appear on the television. But in the wake of the protests, what we saw is relatively, and I will emphasize relatively, more objective protests on the television about these events.
Мне кажется, в освещении надо надо увидеть две стороны. Это
In any coverage, it's necessary to see both sides.
Это телевидение, преимущественно государственное.
So on the one hand, it's the government television, state television,
И интернет.
and the internet.
Ну, во всем своем спектре. Социальные сети, медиа независимые.
In its social spectrum, in independence, its independence, etc.
И очень забавно наблюдать, как освещает ситуацию телевидение.
So and sometimes it's amusing to see how the television, particularly state television, covers the events.
Вы можете его просто не включать.
Well, it's you may not turn it on,
Но интернет есть.
but there is the internet which you can resort to.
И очень многие, в принципе, не смотрят телевидение.
So many people don't watch TV.
И вы обнаружите, что вы просто потеряли время.
So this is a waste of time on the part of the government TV.
В этом смысле понятие инакомыслия, оно как-то вот, мне кажется, приобретает совершенно, то ли размывается, ну, точно отличается от того, как мы понимали инакомыслие в период холодной войны.
So in our time, dissent has a different meaning. It's like somewhat blurred. It's very different from the way we view dissent in the times of the Cold War.
Мне кажется, вообще мы сейчас в России трудно понять, что есть инакомыслие.
It seems to me that in Russia it's very difficult to determine and to understand what dissent is.
В интернете вы можете найти, все, от националистических сайтов до Кавказ-центра.
So in the internet you can find anything from the sites of the nationalists to the Caucasus Center.
Ну да, крупнейшие медиахолдинги, да, выходящие в традиционном печатном варианте, они, конечно же, принадлежат бизнесменам, приближенным к Кремлю.
Naturally, the largest media holdings, they belong to those businessmen who are close to the government, who are associated with the government.
Очень многие могут, работая в этих холдингах, журналистами в этих изданиях, будучи известными, просто иметь собственные блоги и там выражать уж какую-то.
But many journalists who work for these media companies that belong to private individuals, they can have their blogs and they can express their opinions on the internet.
Но есть еще вопрос, что власти в лице и, скажем так, гражданской составляющей, и ее силовой тоже научились использовать интернет.
But the authorities, the civil authorities and the enforcement, the law enforcement authorities, they also learned how to use the internet.
И здесь тоже они проявляют, очевидно, что есть, скажем так, провластные, судя по всему, оплачиваемые блогеры, форумчане, участники форумов.
So it's very easy to tell a blogger supervised by the government from the one who is independent.
И вот эта среда, она, конечно же, скажем так, с одной стороны, вроде бы размывает какую-то концептуальную дискуссию.
So on the one hand, this media is a little blurred, and this the concepts that are discussed, don't have certain well-defined limits.
С другой стороны, это все более и более очевидно. Вот все более и более очевидно, и все более наивными выглядят эти попытки повлиять на свободную дискуссию.
But on the other hand, the attempts to influence the free discussion are becoming more and more naive and more obvious, and it's easier to fight them.
В этом смысле аналогия с поздним Советским Союзом одна.
So in this case, the comparison with the former Soviet Union is just one.
Люди видят прогосударственную позицию в телевидении или в интернете, неважно где.
So people see the pro-government position, let it be TV, printed media or elsewhere.
И просто ей доверяют.
And they don't trust it.
Они ищут альтернативную информацию.
So they are seeking alternative information.
Thank you very much. And we are running a bit short on time since we started late, so I'd like to invite people who have questions to step forward now to the microphone. And what I think we'll do, because we officially only have a little more than 10 minutes, if you could each say your questions in turn, and then we'll try to have the panelists speak to all of them at once. Thank you.
And also, everybody should identify themselves.
Yes,
so
please.
I will identify myself yet again, Kathy Nepomniachtchi. And I have a follow-up question to yours, just the same question away and a little bit different. And it's about the role of the press, particularly in relationship to covering dissent or taken broadly. In the Soviet period, one could argue there was a synergistic relationship between foreign correspondents, especially largely located in the centers in Moscow, and the dissidents. They needed the press, and they needed the foreign press particularly because it was a mode of protection, and it was a way of getting their message out. And it was a way of magnifying their ability to bring change. Foreign press needed the distance, too, as a source of information and stories. This is a narrative that hasn't come up so far. It seems to me that just to take Occupy Wall Street, since it's in the title of the panel, it's not the same relationship, but certainly even in this age of digital media and all kinds of different forms of communication, the Occupy Wall Street movement also needs the press, not just as a source of information, but to magnify their impact. And so is there a particular relationship in reporting dissent between the press and dissenters in general? Is something that this is something very different from the Soviet past or not?
Thanks.
Hello, Luke Harding from The Guardian. I just wondered if the panel would stick its neck out and tell us what it thinks about the prospects for the protest movement in Russia. Will this lead to the demise of Vladimir Putin, or will the protest movement simply kind of fizzle out? And if you're pessimistic, as indeed I am, what makes Russia different from, say, the Arab countries where there has been a change in power from a comparative perspective? I mean, if this revolution isn't going to work here, why not?
Hello, my name is Tonya Samsonova. I'm a radio of Moscow intro Russian journalist. And my question is, when in democratic countries people protest against banks, bankers and unfairness of banking system, it resembles the protests in Russia when people protest against Putin and unfairness of electoral system. And in both situations, people clearly understand that their mission is impossible. Still, they do this. They do so. And how can they really affect the system? Because everybody knows that you can't ruin banks, you can ruin bankers, you can ruin Putin for now. And the outcome of more free press in Russia isn't a good answer for those who really came to the streets to protest, to make him not to win the presidential elections. So how can these movements affect the situation?
Thanks. One more question?
Yes, Professor Huang Yu, from media scholar from Hong Kong and China. Just want to supplement Professor Stiglitz about Chinese press allowed to attack the corruption. In fact, actually, this is a very tricky question because Chinese press even controlled and managed even more seriously by the state. The so-called allowing attack the corruption is actually partially related to the power struggle internal of the party leadership. But as you mentioned, that real way, kind of a corruption is one particular school of the party want to, down, and the other side so allow the press to do such things. But other than that, I don't feel Chinese press in press or freedom has any progress in the last 10 years.
Okay. Thank you. So let's jump right into responding to the questions. To recap, we had a question about the relationship between the press and dissenters, the future of Russia and Putin, and how can protests be effective, and how can they measure their success? So anyone who'd like to jump in can.
I guess I'll take on the first question. In truth, I don't think the relationship between dissidents and foreign correspondents in the Soviet Union is that different than the relationship between reporters in Moscow today and the opposition movements, or reporters in New York and the Occupy Wall Street protesters. The fact is that all reporters have symbiotic relationships with their sources. They want the information. The sources want the publicity. Again, that's a little bit of a generalization. Of course, there's a lot of nuances here. A lot of the dissidents in the Soviet Union were doing something very risky by contacting foreign correspondents. We know that, and certainly the Occupy Wall Street protesters are not going to get into that kind of trouble by talking to reporters. But having said that, I think the dynamic is relatively similar. I do think that in Moscow today, if you look at Navalny, for example, who is the prominent blogger, or if you look at Evgenia Cherikova, who is a prominent environmental activist, she in particular has sought out Western journalists and Russian journalists very actively because she wants to get her story out, because it kind of empowers her, it empowers her movement. It's an enormous amplification, especially when you are shut out, as she has been, from the mainstream Russian media, or certainly the Russian TV and the Russian radio. And I don't think that's any different than a dissident in 1973 in Brezhnev-era Soviet Union. So I want to emphasize I am drawing a little bit of a broad brush here, but I do think that reporters want to use their sources, and their sources want to use reporters. And it has been, it is, and it always will be.
Yeah. Let me just make a couple comments. One of them is this distinction between providing information and mobilizing. There's always the hope on the part of, say, dissidents, that if only people knew, that would mobilize them. And I think that's not true. I think that that's why, people in the political parties work very hard to figure out what their message is, even to the point where they test various ways of saying the same thing, and figure out what the response of the listener is. You can say the same sentence, but put the adjectives in 3 different ways, and it has different emotive responses. Advertising agencies, of course, do this as well. And that's is related to, in a way, why the internet is may not be a very effective way of mobilizing, because the internet has different communities, and the only people listening are the people who are already converted. It's not quite true, but to a large extent, you have these separate communities on the internet where the people who already believe that there needs to be change are reading the internet sites, and the others aren't seeing it. And this is a real concern about the internet and its ability to mobilize. I mean, there are instances where it has been able to do the mobilization. That's why, in a way, there's a little bit of a randomness to whether the protest movements are successful. As I say, I don't think the the protest movements in the globalization that I talked about in 1999, they didn't have a press officer who was trying to figure out what was the message they ought to get across and how to articulate it. It just, they had a number of messages, and the press looked at some of the things, and they really were sufficiently salient that it worked. I think the same thing is true about Occupy Wall Street, but I think they were lucky. They picked on a couple of issues that were really resonated. And the two were the bankers' bonuses and the We Are the 99%. And those were really, they couldn't have been much better if they had called a media company and said, how do we get our messages across? I think those were two very powerful messages, and I think that worked. But this is a real problem, I think, with protest movements, because they're organic. They're not run by a press office. And sometimes they get messages that succeed, and sometimes they don't. And I think part of the job of the press, I think, is to try to figure out what they ought, if they did have a press office, what would they be doing, and how would they put it? Because they really are, their intent is not just to give information, it really is to mobilize. There is a sense, there is a sense in which most of the protesters probably don't really think that they're going to succeed. You know, the reason you're protesting is that you see the system not working. And do you really believe that by going out in the street and shouting a little bit, you're going to change real politique, the real forces that are at play? I think that most people don't really think that, but there's always a glimmer of hope that you will, and there are always a few of those cases where it has happened. Tunisia seemed to really work in the way that people wanted. Issue of whether Egypt is working the way people wanted is really much less clear, and the same thing is true about Russia. I think that. But even when it doesn't fully accomplish what you want, and go back to the globalization, it does change mindsets. Occupy Wall Street, I think the 99%, that's now become part of has really resonated. It affected some of the speeches of President Obama, and it will, I think, affect the elections. I mean, I think it will tarnish one of the candidates if it's one of those 1% that gets elected who doesn't pay taxes. It will be a much more difficult for him to run his campaign, given the Occupy Wall Street. So there is a sense that, you know, high chance it won't work, but even if it has a little bit of effect, it's worth pushing.
Thank you, Joe. We're officially over time, but I hope we can take just a couple of minutes to finish hearing some responses.
Я на самом деле в одну фразу, наверное, уложусь.
I think I will just, say one sentence.
Мне кажется, что люди имеют уже хороший опыт, скажем так, промывки мозгов. То есть прошли через хороший опыт.
Because many people in various countries went through this, horrible experience of brainwashing.
И все сложнее и сложнее, скажем так,
It's becoming more and more difficult to
влиять,
do it in our time.
да, влиять на сознание. Соответственно, всякие попытки СМИ встраиваться в какую-то систему борьбы с инакомыслием.
So any attempts of the mass media to incorporate their efforts in the struggle against dissent.
На самом деле просто дискредитируют это СМИ.
Discredit the mass media.
И в этом, то есть в данном случае медиа просто теряет свою вот кредитность.
So this part of the mass media just loses its credibility.
А в условиях свободной, то есть, соответственно, аудитория обладает высокой волатильностью, ликвидностью, я бы сказала.
So the readers and the viewers, they are more volatile, or liquid.
А в условиях высокой конкуренции медиа, доступности медиа.
But in the sphere of very high, forgot the word. competitiveness of the different, representatives of mass media.
Соответственно, это уже вопрос элементарной, скажем так, кредитоспособности, вот элементарное доверие к СМИ.
So it is the question of trust.
Это уже ваш выбор СМИ, прессы, это выбор менеджмента этой
So it
прессы.
is the choice of the people, of the viewers and readers, and those managers who run different units of mass media.
Well, thank you so much. I regret that we're out of time because I feel like we've just touched the tip of the iceberg with a lot of these issues. But I hope that it got the thought juices flowing. And I would like to extend a huge thank you to our panelists for taking time to speak with us today. It was a pleasure.